Chris Gardiner.
Tell us a bit about your Marconi career.
I was recruited in South Africa to Marconi's in Chelmsford back in 1978. I was working in South Africa at the time for South Africa Broadcasting Corporation, and somebody from Marconi's was out in South Africa, rang me up and said, "Why don't you come to Chelmsford?"
And
so I did.
The offer? What year would that be?
That was right at the very end of 1978.
Were you getting homesick for Blighty?
No.
Must be the money then.
No, I took a pay cut to come to Marconi's, which is not surprising compared with some companies, but I came home mainly because my eldest child was due to start school and I wanted him to have a British education.
Where were you living in South Africa?
Johannesburg.
Joburg.
Joburg.
Was it a good life?
It was not quite as natural as life is in this country, for the simple reason that apartheid still existed.
So you wanted your children to be brought up in a free society?
Basically, yes.
And where did you start work for Marconi?
In New Street in Chelmsford.
Well, carry on.
Sorry, I was worried.
A tad closer. Hold it. That's it.
Okay.
That should pick it up now. So you started at New Street. What year? What month?
Right at the end of 1978, I came home to work in there. Having worked for South Africa Broadcasting, it was natural that I should start work in Marconi's broadcasting division.
And what did you do?
I was in essentially sales, but I was the engineer in the sales department.
What did you engineer?
Transmitter systems.
And what did you actually do?
A lot of the work that I did was liaison with other parts of the company and create the paperwork that was related to making offers to customers.
How was the state of Marconi at that time? Was it thriving?
Yes, there was still the broadcasting division at that time, late 78, still had a thriving studio division, although it wasn't perhaps as thriving as it had been earlier, but the transmitter division was still working very well and still had the full range of transmitters, being shortwave, medium wave, then through the FM transmitters and all the television transmitters.
You must have been really thrilled not only to leave South Africa in its tragic state as it was, but to come here and be involved in the cutting-edge technology of its day?
Yes, that was the problem. It wasn't entirely cutting edge by then, because the development of new transmitters was not going at the sort of pace and the cutting edge that it had been.
That means lack of investment.
Correct.
So it led eventually to frustration?
It didn't frustrate me seriously and on a personal basis, but it did frustrate me on a sort of company basis, because I could see the way things were going. I'd worked in South Africa, you see, on a new television system, and we had new equipment, and South Africa had purchased all the best test equipment that was available at the time. I came back to Marconi's here in Chelmsford and found that their development department was working with equipment that was so old, it was stuff that I had learnt on in the BBC 20 years previously.
What did you do about all this? Soldier on?
Soldier on. That's all you can do.
And how long were you employed at New Street?
Until I retired in 2003.
Did you get out before the collapse?
Yes.
Why?
Because, as I said, the broadcasting division had virtually collapsed by then. And I'd done a little bit of work in my last sort of 2 years there on mobile radio, but even that wasn't enough to keep going. And since I was offered a very satisfactory redundancy package, I took it. And at the time I was 62, so I was near enough to the retirement age that things could be, I could cope financially.
So you slipped out and you naughty boy managed to get yourself a pension?
Correct.
Before the plug was pulled?
Correct.
And you survive as proof to this day?
Correct.
What do you think about this exhibition we've got here?
Very nice. I was worried, this is the first time I've seen it. I haven't been down to look prior to this. And I was worried that it was going to be difficult to acquire enough stuff and enough to make it interesting. I think, in fact, Chris and his team have survived, achieved it exceedingly well.
Against the odds, and the main exhibits, as it were, are people like yourself. It's talking and meeting Marconi veterans. It's the great thrill here, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I walk down, even now when I come into town, I walk down the high street, it's very unusual that I do not meet somebody I know who are ex-Marconi.
People would not believe that Marconi New Street employed at its 4,000 people?
When
6,000?
When I came in 1978, there were about 4,000 employees of Marconi's and 14 sites dotted around Chelmsford.
It's amazing. And do you remember the rush hour when all the bicycles came out?
No, that was before my time. Yes, by then I've heard stories of it being absolute chaos in New Street when Hoffman's came out, Marconi's came out, and they had the old railway bridge. Now that was way before my time. By the time I arrived, a lot of people were travelling by cars and other methods of transport, and the huge mass of bicycles didn't exist.
I think that was the 60s. The
Possibly.
last of the 60s.
Could well be.
There's a classic Essex Chronicle picture taken by the late Peter Russell, taken from the police station, let's say, towards the bridge. And I mean, it was a bit like China. Even now, I think China's changing.
Yes. And of course, if you go back a little bit further than that, they would drive the cattle along New Street to the market as well.
Going back to Marconi, do you have any proud moments, any achievements that, you know, the sinking ship was able to achieve, or was it really paddling very fast?
No, I don't think it was it was quite a gentle decline. There wasn't a sort of over the edge of a cliff type collapse.
A bit like the Roman Empire.
Yes. My claim to fame, I believe, is that I actually commissioned the last transmitter that Marconi ever made, in terms of putting a Marconi name on the front of it.
Right. Tell me about your claim to fame.
Well, we had built 2 transmitters, 500 kilowatt shortwave transmitters, the biggest size of transmitter that's ever been built on shortwave. We built 2 of them as a development project. One of them was sold to Egypt, and eventually the second one went to Voice of America in Sri Lanka, more or less at about the same time. The one in Egypt was the one that I went out to commission. I'd never commissioned a transmitter before, certainly not at this power level, and somebody said, well, go out and do the best you can. So I did, and I got it working. And then it took me another 10 months to persuade the Egyptians to sign the acceptance certificate.
Why is that?
They were they were frightened.
Of what?
That it wouldn't work when I left. And they were probably correct. But that's customers for you.
And did you have to stay there for?
Yeah, I stayed there I was there for about 13 months. Living in Alexandria.
Lovely.
In the Cecil Hotel.
Oh, if you please.
A very famous hotel. Somerset Maugham, Agatha Christie, Winston Churchill, Eisenhower had all stayed there at some time or other.
The last days of the Raj.
Yes, overlooking, of course, the famous harbour of Alexandria and the Pharos.
You must have missed home then.
No, I never miss home. Home is where I am.
That must have been the last great fling, really.
More or less. I mean, I've been to other places since, because I worked subsequently to that on a mobile radio job. I worked in Saudi Arabia.
Tell us about those days, because a lot of Marconi's work were for the Gulf states.
Yes, we had done business throughout my career, various places.
Presumably, is this still Official Secrets Act?
Well, no, because you see,
to it?
No, I never had to. I was never subject to the Official Secrets Act because broadcasting isn't, in that sense, secret.
Oh, it's open mic.
Not in. Well, I mean, there are obviously commercial secrets that one has to keep, but we would not be doing anything because we were working for broadcasting organisations around the world, and of course BBC and ITV in this country. That is not secret work.
Not the armaments industry.
No.
No. And tell us a bit about your broadcasting work in the Gulf states.
Very little practical work, because most of the time, being in the sales department, one would go down and visit customers and do assessments and surveys and things before the project had actually started. And then, of course, other people, once it had been sold and the contract was in place, other people like the project manager would tend to take over.
It must have been quite exciting, travelling, working on these projects. I mean, you know what I mean by exciting. Just you got a buzz out of it.
I've always had a buzz out of broadcasting ever since the days that I joined the BBC. There's something it's difficult to explain because until you've done it.
Go back to the BBC. How did you get involved there with broadcasting?
Well, it was 1963. The BBC was recruiting quite heavily because BBC Two was in the pipeline. I'd always had an interest in sort of, I won't say broadcasting work, but at school I'd done a lot of tape recording, and I used to work with things like the projectors. This was, of course, years before the days of computers. So,
did you make yourself a radiator wireless?
Oh yes, I had built my own radios since about the age of 10. So when I was in by the sixth form in school, I would go and take the projector to pieces and clean it out and put it back together and make sure it was working properly.
I did that, but it never went back together.
And subsequently, when I was working overseas in Zambia, that sort of mechanical ability was very useful to me, because if you can put a projector together, you can also repair typewriters, and you can repair sewing machines, both of which tend to be owned by young ladies. A very useful thing to have, facility to have.
Right. So there you go. You've left school, and the only place you want to work is the BBC. Or?
As I said, that sort of school work of tape recording and what I did, as I say, with projectors and audiovisual generally, it was natural that one should follow on and go into something a bit more formal, like broadcasting. And as I say, since the BBC was.
So where did you go? Bush House?
No, I worked for a place.
City,
no, I worked for a place, Tatsfield. It was a BBC engineering monitoring station near Westerham in Kent. And I worked there for a few years.
As an apprentice? As a trainee?
They called us technical assistants. They sent us up on various courses to the BBC training school, which at that time was in Evesham. They had their Evesham was the BBC's standard training school, and after officially 3 years, I did it in 2.5 years. They then called you, rather than a technician, they called you an engineer. So I became a broadcasting engineer. In the late, I went In the late 60s, I went down to Ascension Island for 9 months because that was their overseas relay station in the South Atlantic, and that was where I really acquired the liking for sunshine. It was nice and warm, and I came back to the UK, decided I didn't like it, and the BBC at the time was going through a very unhappy stage. Late 68, 69 this would be. They had a strike. They had their first ever strike, which was not really, shouldn't have been a strike. But one thing and another, I decided at the time was leave, and an overseas aid project through Crown agents came up in Zambia. So I left the BBC and went to work for Zambia Broadcasting Services.
And that's how you ended up in Africa and South Africa?
In generally, but I mean Zambia was nice and warm, and the sun shined, and the natives were friendly.
Did you take your family?
I didn't have family. I met my wife in Zambia. We married in Zambia, and we went to the falls for our honeymoon. Not the Niagara, the Victoria.
But you fell for her?
Oh yes, it was a sort of mutually satisfactory arrangement. And we came home after our 3-year contract ended to here, and I was almost immediately recruited to go and work for a job in South Africa.
Which you took with both hands?
I took because I needed, A, because I needed a job, and B, because I liked that part of the world. And of course, having been in independent Zambia, because this was 6 years after Zambia had had independence, to go into South Africa in the mid-70s in the era of apartheid was quite a big jump, and one had to cope with it very carefully. I mean by that because we in South Africa Broadcasting we had a lot of local African riggers and people, and they would sort of tend to address me in Afrikaans, and I had to work very hard to sort of say to them, look, I'm not an Afrikaner, I'm an Englishman. Please don't call me sir, in the servile sense that they tend to do in Afrikaans. I said, if you want to, please call me Mr. Chris. It is a much more satisfactory arrangement, and as a result, of course, we got on fine. No problems. But after 4 or 5 years, I'm trying to work out, it would have been about 5 years in South Africa, when my children was coming up to school age, we came home.
What do you think of the exhibition here again? You said you're quite impressed.
I'm very impressed at what they have managed to achieve with virtually no sort of professional backup. I'm not implying that any of them are incompetent, but it's not to put an exhibition together at relatively short notice in what is not a bespoke exhibition hall is really very good indeed.
And what would your message be to broadcasting veterans, Marconi veterans, about the exhibition?
Come and see it if you can. It's a good place to come and meet other veterans, other people from Marconi.
Mm-hmm. And youngsters who are thinking of a career in broadcasting, radio, wireless?
I'm not sure that that is a difficult question for me to answer in my age, because broadcasting has changed to such an extent, particularly with the advent of the computer, that I'm not certain that broadcasting as I knew it now exists. Programs are still put out, but they're produced in a totally different way.
How do you mean?
Well,
the equipment, the people are the same.
The equipment is different, and the attitudes of the people are different. I fear that the problem is essentially financial. When I was in broadcasting, the BBC and the ITV and others, obviously they had budgets, but they weren't the top of the list when they made a programme, because a programme should be made, and that is broadcasting in really the best sense of the word. Nowadays, if you want to make a program, as I understand it, the first question is not will it be a good program, but how much is it going to cost you? And that, of course, totally skews the program itself.
Well, as they say, that's showbiz. Thank you very much indeed.